John Lennon had been to art galleries before. He had met artists before. He had walked into rooms full of strange and interesting things and walked back out unchanged. On the night of November 9, 1966, he walked into a gallery in London expecting to find something provocative and found something else entirely. Something that required a ladder to reach and a magnifying glass to read and a willingness to believe that a single word printed on a white ceiling could mean something real. He was not a man who was easily stopped by things. He had not been stopped in years. That night, one word stopped him. The artist who had written it was standing at the other end of the room. He had not noticed her yet, but he would. Mason's Yard was a quiet courtyard off Duke Street in London, the kind of place you had to know was there to find. On the evening of November 9th, 1966, John Lennon found it because a friend named John Dunbar had insisted. Dunbar co-ran the gallery and had a sense, difficult to articulate, that the exhibition opening that night was something Lennon specifically needed to see. John had been restless for months. The Beatles had stopped touring in August, and the silence that followed had not been easy to fill. He arrived before the show officially opened, which meant the gallery was still being arranged. He pushed through the door and stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the space. It was small. It smelled of fresh paint. White objects were distributed across the floor with a precision that made him slow down, without knowing why. He moved through the room the way he moved through most spaces, without asking permission, handling things, reading cards, picking objects up and setting them down. An apple on a pedestal with a price tag. A canvas on the wall with instructions to add to it. A box with an unfinished object inside, waiting for a visitor to complete it. Each piece asks something of the person standing in front of it. Each piece assumed the person would respond. John stopped at several of them longer than he expected to. He was not in the habit of stopping. He had spent the previous 4 years moving continuously, city to city, stage to stage, interview to interview. And the stillness of this room, the specific demand it was making on his attention, was unfamiliar enough to slow him down. He read one card twice. He set one object down and picked it up again. Then he saw the ladder. It was white, standing alone at the center of the room, reaching toward a small canvas mounted on the ceiling. A magnifying glass hung from a chain at the top. He crossed the room and stood at the base of it. There was no card explaining the ladder. There was no instruction. The ladder was simply there, pointing upward, and at the top of it was something too small to read from where he stood. He put his foot on the first rung. No one in the room told him to stop. No one invited him to continue. He climbed the ladder because it was there and because the thing at the top was beyond his reach, and because, in a way he could not have explained before that moment, but could have explained after. Being stopped at the bottom had not felt like an option. He climbed. He reached the magnifying glass. He held it over the canvas. The word printed on the canvas was so small it was invisible from the floor. Through the lens, in pencil, in letters no larger than a grain of rice. Yes. He held the glass there for a moment. Then he held it there longer. He later described this moment in interviews more than almost any other single moment in his life, returning to it with the attentiveness of someone who understood that everything had pivoted on a detail and wanted to make sure the detail was not lost. He said the word could have been anything. It could have been no. It could have been wrong, or stop, or nothing at all. If it had been no, he would have climbed back down and left, and the rest of his life would have been different in every way that mattered. It was yes. He stood at the top of the ladder for a long time before he came back down. At the far side of the room stood a wooden board covered in nails, hammered in at irregular intervals by visitors who had been given a hammer and an instruction card. Add a nail. He picked up the hammer. A woman appeared at his shoulder, Japanese, in her early 30s, dark hair, watching him with the calm attentiveness of someone who has been observing people respond to this piece for days. She said the exhibition was not yet officially open. If he wanted to add a nail, it would cost 5 shillings. He looked at the board. He looked at her. He said he would give her an imaginary 5 shillings if she gave him an imaginary nail. There was a pause. She said later that it was the correct answer, that the piece had been designed to test exactly this kind of response. He had not known he was being tested. He had passed anyway. Her name was Yoko Ono, and she had built this entire exhibition herself. He did not know her work. He did not know her. What he found in the first few minutes of conversation was someone who spoke about art the way he had always wanted to speak about music, not in terms of what it reached or who it pleased, but in terms of what it was trying to do and whether it was honest. She had been working in a tradition most people had never heard of, making pieces that required the audience to finish them. She was not famous. She was not trying to be famous in the way the world he had come from understood fame. She was trying to make things that were true. He had spent 4 years doing the same thing inside a context so loud that the truth in it was sometimes difficult to locate. They began to talk about this without quite naming it. The conversation was unlike most conversations he had. He was accustomed to being agreed with, to rooms organized around his comfort, to questions that gave him permission to say what he already intended to say. She did not do this. She challenged 3 separate things he said in the first 20 minutes. She was not performing disagreement. She simply disagreed in the direct way of someone who has no investment in your approval. He found this disorienting and then found it necessary, the way a window is necessary in a room that has been sealed too long. He challenged her back. She answered without retreating. He looked at his watch at some point and then stopped looking at his watch. The gallery was supposed to close. The other people in the room had left. He and Yoko Ono were still talking. Outside on Mason's Yard, London was continuing without them. He did not leave at the time he had planned to leave. He did not leave at the time the gallery closed. He stayed because the conversation had produced something he did not want to interrupt, a quality of attention that he had not found in a room with another person in longer than he could easily identify. She was asking him things that no one had asked him, not about the music or the band or what it felt like to be known by everyone. She was asking him what he actually thought. She was asking him what he actually believed. These questions, which would have seemed ordinary for most people, were extraordinary in the specific context of his life, a life in which the noise had been so sustained and so total that the quieter questions had stopped getting through. He had not realized until that evening how much he had missed being asked them. John Lennon returned to Indica Gallery the following morning. He went without calling ahead, without an invitation, without a reason beyond the simple fact that the conversation from the night before felt unfinished. He was not in the habit of returning to places. He had lived for most of his adult life in one direction. Always forward, always toward the next thing, never back. He went back. She was there, still arranging work, still in the same deliberate and unhurried mode he had observed the night before. They talked for several hours. He left. He came back the day after that, and at some point in the days that followed, without either of them naming it, the visits became a pattern, and the pattern became the most significant part of his week. She gave him a copy of her book before the month was out. It was called Grapefruit, a small, plain-covered volume of instruction pieces, each one a brief text describing an action the reader was invited to imagine or perform. He took it home. He read it in one sitting. He read it again. He later said it was among the books that had most affected him. Not because it was comfortable, but because it asked something of him that almost nothing else had. To finish the work himself, to bring himself to it rather than simply receive it. The correspondence that followed, letters, objects, small invitations passed back and forth, continued through 1967. Slowly, carefully, neither rushing what was happening nor naming it. John was still married to Cynthia Lennon, and the months that followed November 9th were ones that Cynthia would later describe, in her memoir, as containing a change she could feel but not explain. He was present in the house in the physical sense. In every other sense he was more absent than he had ever been. He read more, he went out alone, and came back quiet. She did not know about the gallery. She did not know about Yoko Ono, or the book, or the hours of conversation in a small room in Mason's yard. She knew, with the accuracy that people develop about the people they love, that something had been found, that somewhere outside this house, something had opened in him that had not been opened before. She did not know what it was. She knew it was not hers. The Yes painting stayed with John Lennon for the rest of his life. He returned to it in interviews more than almost any other single object or moment. Always the same details, always the same quiet precision, the smallness of the word, the necessity of the latter, the fact that it could have been different. He understood it as a philosophical position, a world that required effort to reach, and answered that effort with affirmation. He married Yoko Ono in 1969. They separated, reconciled, had a son, made music, and lived in a building across from Central Park. He was shot outside the Dakota Building on December 8, 1980. Everything between November 9, 1966, and that night, the reconciliation, Sean, the Dakota years, the music that came after, was already inside the word he found at the top of a ladder? Yes,